Divine feminine power. That's the topic of today's Soul, Sovereignty, and Sexuality podcast with myself, Jessica Falcon, International Soul Embodiment Guide and Divine Feminine Activator. You probably heard me say, if you listened to last week's episode, that I was in the midst of creating a Divine Feminine Power initiation. And this has been within me gestating as a creation for a long time. And it feels as if it's finally time to unveil it. So this week is the official opening of temple doors into the 7-month initiation into divine feminine power. For those souls who are deeply called into the remembrance of who they are, to reclaim their truth and power and sovereignty. And I want to talk about what divine feminine power even is, because I believe that my perspective of divine feminine power is very different than a lot of what I see and hear out there in the world on social media. Because so much of what I see or come across around femininity and feminine power, divine feminine, is actually based on gender stereotypes, cultural conditioning, and heritage beliefs that we continue to perpetuate and limit ourselves by, rather than what my personal experience of divine feminine power actually is. Because I look at it from a historical perspective. You could say that I'm talking about ancient feminine power. And when we look at the feminine from a historical perspective, the feminine was very closely linked with the earth. Women represented the earth in ancient times. And at the same time that the earth was no longer recognized as divine is the exact same time that women were no longer recognized as divine, because they were inextricably linked. And this lack of recognition of the divinity of the feminine, which included woman and the earth and the body and life, was because of a shift in beliefs, a shift in consciousness. This is well over 5,000 years ago, that said the divine we now only recognize out there, up above, outside of earth, outside of life. And therefore, if the divine is outside of life, the divine is outside of you. The divine is outside of your body. The divine was no longer recognized in woman as a result of that shift in consciousness. Because prior to this, the divine was recognized in woman, in the body, on the earth, and in life, because the ancients prior to this knew what we'll call religious belief, recognize the divine in all things, from a plant to each element to each person, because they knew that without the earth, water, fire, air, there was no life. They couldn't exist, and therefore, of course, you would recognize them as holy and divine. And without going into all of the whys and the history around this, when what became known as Judaism, what became known later as Christianity, and I'm not anti-religion in any way, shape, or form, but we need to understand and choose what to believe rather than simply taking what we've been told as truth. And with this new formation of beliefs came the damnation of earth as devoid of spirit, rather than recognizing spirit in matter as it had been done for a very, very long time. Ultimately, my perception and my research and my own memories of past lives is that this was done with the intent to control. Because when you recognize the divine within you and you operate as that, which is your sovereignty, you cannot be controlled. You cannot be possessed. You cannot be owned. Fear loses its grip because you see beyond the illusion of fear. Many theorize that one of the reasons that women were oppressed and dominated is because men actually feared their power. It's also because they feared their capacity to create life when life was no longer deemed something holy. And when you don't deem life holy, nor do you deem those who create life as holy. Instead, you damn them and you demonize them. It's ironic because men who demonized women came from the wombs of women. Couldn't exist at all without women. So, there's a lot to say about all of that. But my point of today's conversation is that if we want to come into our sovereignty, it requires a reclamation of the feminine as divine, whether you be a man or a woman. Because the feminine in this historical ancient context is the recognition of the holiness of your body, is the recognition of the holiness of life, the holiness of the earth, which is the recognition of your soul. The reclamation of your soul, your divinity here in form, is the reclamation of the feminine as divine. And when we look at the feminine in this way, the reclamation of the feminine as divine, as the necessary step to embody our divinity, which is essential to reclaim our sovereignty, we get rid of the cultural stereotypes, labelings, gender qualifications around feminine, and we look at the raw core truth of the feminine. Because the feminine is anything but passive. And I know there's a lot of polarity consciousness teachings out there. Let's just say I don't agree with them, because that is not my personal experience of the feminine or the masculine. Nor is it union, sacred union. Because in order to be sovereign, we must harness the ability to be in our feminine and our masculine, because we are whole and complete unto self, rather than depending on or needing something outside of us to complete us. That is the opposite of sovereignty. That is the opposite of embodying your divinity. That is the opposite of your soul truth. And if we look at the feminine as the earth, she is anything but passive. She is the epitome of the divine feminine. Because in order to return to our feminine power, we return to the goddess, we return to the earth. And she is what allows us and helps us and aids us to do so in that reclamation of our own divinity and our own power and sovereignty and truth. And the earth is certainly not submissive, though she has been dominated and continues to be dominated by those who believe that they have power over her, when in truth, we could all be destroyed by her in an instant. If you've ever experienced a flood, as I have, or a massive storm, or a tsunami, earthquake, who's in control? Not us. Not us. If you've ever tried to live without water, tried to live without food, yeah, how long will that last you? How long will that last you? This remembrance of her divinity is to begin to recognize that the earth is a conscious, sentient being. There are so many scientific studies that show that the earth stays the exact temperature needed to sustain life on this planet. So many scientific studies that point to the sentient nature of the earth. And the only reason that we believe that we can dominate or have control over her is because we have forgotten her divinity and her consciousness and have somehow put ourselves above her rather than with her. The reclamation of the feminine as divine has nothing to do with power over one or the other. In fact, it is the recognition of soul. And when you recognize the divine within you, you cannot help but recognize the divine in the other, in all of life. Because you see that we are in this interconnected web. If you're familiar with the flower of life, it represents this beautifully. We all share the same ultimate DNA. We all are connected to this web of life because we all come from source, God's source. What you do affects me, what I do affects you, no matter how far away we are from each other on the planet. And our collective consciousness affects the consciousness of the earth and vice versa. Which is why, as the earth is rising into her power, women are being asked to do the same. And men are also being asked to reclaim the feminine within them. And this idea that we are only one or the other, how many women want to be with a man who never feels anything, or who is in a hierarchical, dominating, I have power over you, I do not see you because you are inferior to me relationship, or isn't connected to their body at all, and therefore probably isn't very good in bed. Or who doesn't revere the sacredness of you or life, or isn't in their heart. Because these are all aspects of being in the feminine. I certainly have no interest in being in a relationship with anyone, particularly a man who isn't in their heart, who doesn't recognize their own soul. And so to say that the feminine is reserved simply for women is to be fooling ourselves. Because we all ultimately, in order to come back in the union, come back to sovereignty, come back to power, come back to source, have to begin to recognize the divine within ourselves and live that. So the reclamation of the feminine as divine is to embody your divinity and to bridge heaven and earth through your consciousness, so we get rid of the split in consciousness that created the denial of the holiness in woman, body, earth, life. And that's why, as we reclaim the divine feminine, the quote feminine traits include body wisdom, womb wisdom, our capacity to love, pleasure, desire, sensuality, sexuality, joy, abundance, and wealth, which are all huge components of the divine feminine power initiation that begins September 27th. Magic, intuition, because as we return to and unify with our soul or divinity here in form, we descend into the depths of our body and connect with the energy of our soul in form. And we bridge this consciousness of heaven on earth, and we recognize the sacredness of all of life. We allow life to bubble up through us. We activate our life force energy, and we remember we're not here to do, work, produce, seek approval, validation, permission, all of that outside of us. And we get to lean back. We get to soften. We get to surrender. We get to let go into the feminine, into the soul, into the divinity that provides all. We get to remember that we are here to revel in the sacredness of life, that we are here to allow the desire for life to move through us, which includes the desire for sex, which includes the desire for connection, which includes the desire for play and pleasure, because that is our birthright. And all of that comes from the heart. What is connection without love? What is life without love? The goddess is love. The feminine, that reclamation of the feminine is love here in life. Love returned, embodied, reclaimed, remembered in every aspect of who you are, in every aspect of your existence. And so I invite you into this deeper reclamation of your own feminine power through this 7-month initiation that begins September 27th. There are really special bonuses available if you register before September 13th, including a one-on-one session with me, an activation of the wealth that is your birthright that you can begin as soon as you register. And I'll put all the links below in the show notes. You can also go to thepathtosovereignty.com. I'll continue to have conversations about divine feminine power, about aspects of the feminine, aspects of sexuality, aspects of the earth over the next few months, because today was simply the tip of the iceberg, an introduction, a redefinition of how we look at the feminine, how we look at the feminine as divine, how we look at feminine power, which allows us to free ourselves of the bindings of who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to act based on what somebody else thinks or wants, because the feminine as divine doesn't conform to anything outside of her. She lives from the inside out. She lives from the truth of her soul. She lives from her divine power. And that is the reclamation that I offer you. Sending you so much love on your own journey. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. Mwah.